Snow whipped sideways as the former seal crested the ridge, when he saw the dog first, standing unnaturally still, muscles locked, eyes burning through the storm. The canine refused to leave the woman at its feet, her body half buried in ice, a steel chain disappearing beneath the snow. Blood darkened the dog's fur where it had clearly fought something, or someone, off. Even as hypothermia clawed at her, the animal leaned into her, shielding her from the wind, daring death to come closer. But who had chained them there, and why was the dog still guarding the secret? Before the storm rewrote everything, his life was built on routines designed to keep ghosts at bay, the former seal rising before dawn in a mountain town where winter ruled half the year and silence felt earned, not empty, his days measured by long trail runs, wood smoke, and the discipline that never quite leaves a man trained to survive when the world collapses. He had chosen this place because it was hard, because the cold demanded respect and the wilderness didn't pretend to be kind, and because up here he could still feel useful, scanning ridgelines, reading tracks in fresh snow, trusting instincts sharpened by years where hesitation meant death. On the far edge of that same wilderness, unaware of him entirely, lived the woman with the dog, their world smaller but no less bound by devotion, her life structured around care, patience, and the quiet responsibility of loving an animal that had already saved her once before. The dog was a working canine, broad-chested and scar-marked, trained for obedience but ruled by intuition, its coat thick and dark against the snow, its eyes always measuring distance and threat, always counting exits, and yet impossibly gentle with her, moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped, sleeping close enough that their breathing synchronized without effort. Their days followed predictable rhythms, early walks through frozen tree lines, shared meals eaten slowly as the dog waited until she finished, evenings spent with the animal's head pressed against her leg as if anchoring her to the present. And anyone watching would have understood instantly that this was not ownership but partnership, a bond formed through trust built one quiet moment at a time. She had taken the long way back to herself after a past she never fully spoke about, finding steadiness in responsibility, finding safety in the dog's constant presence, believing that as long as they stayed together, nothing truly bad could reach them. But subtle fractures had already begun to show, tiny enough to ignore at first, like the way the dog would pause mid-step on familiar paths, nostrils flaring at scents the wind carried from nowhere, or the way it began sleeping facing the door instead of the window, muscles tensed even in rest. She noticed the change but told herself it was winter making everything sharper, colder, more alert, never considering that the world beyond their small routines was moving toward them with intent. The seal, too, felt it in his own way during those same days, a creeping sense of being watched when he crossed certain trails, the silence holding too long, animal tracks cutting across his own and doubling back in ways that didn't make sense, but he dismissed it as old instincts refusing to stand down, the mind inventing threats where none existed. The mountains, however, remember everything, and they had already witnessed movements after dark, engines idling too quietly, figures stopping where they shouldn't, and chains being tested against frozen earth. The dog felt the shift first, its behavior tightening into something sharper, refusing to stray far from her side, placing itself between her and the forest whenever the wind changed direction, its loyalty hardening into vigilance. On the morning everything began to unravel, the snow fell heavier than forecast, swallowing sound and distance alike, and the dog lingered longer than usual before stepping outside, as if memorizing the warmth behind them. Neither of them knew that by nightfall routine would be replaced by terror, that trust would be tested in ways neither training nor love could fully prepare them for, or that somewhere beyond the storm, a man trained to recognize the shape of danger was already being pulled unknowingly toward the moment their lives would collide. The storm did not arrive all at once but pressed inward slowly, tightening its grip hour by hour until the world narrowed to drifting white and the sense that something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of perception. And it was within that tightening silence that the dog's instincts sharpened into urgency, its body never fully relaxing, head lifting at sounds too faint for human ears, paws cutting deliberate paths through snow that had begun to erase familiar landmarks. The woman felt the shift in her chest before she understood it logically, an unease that settled deep and refused to be reasoned away, and she found herself adjusting plans without knowing why, shortening walks, checking locks twice, keeping the dog closer than usual even indoors, its presence becoming a physical reassurance against the cold and the growing sense of being observed. Outside, the forest responded to the storm by retreating, birds vanishing, small animals burrowing deep, leaving behind a stillness that felt wrong, and the dog reacted to that absence as strongly as it would have to a visible threat, circling the perimeter of their cabin with increasing frequency, stopping often to sniff at drifts where no tracks should have remained, hackles rising at scents that the wind carried and concealed in equal measure. The first sign that something was truly off came in the form of unfamiliar tracks half filled by fresh snowfall near the edge of their property, boot prints heavy and purposeful, appearing and disappearing as if the storm itself were trying to erase evidence, and the dog's reaction to them was immediate and fierce, body lowering, chest vibrating with restrained warning, eyes locked on the treeline as though daring whatever had passed through to return. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that hikers wandered through sometimes, that the mountains were not hers alone, yet the dog refused to be reassured, blocking her path when she tried to follow the tracks, forcing her back toward the safety of the cabin, its loyalty manifesting not as affection but as command. Nightfall came early beneath the thickening clouds, darkness settling heavy and absolute, and with it came sounds that did not belong to wind or wildlife, muffled mechanical hums that faded when she strained to listen, the distant crunch of snow compressed under unfamiliar weight, and each time the dog responded before she could consciously register anything at all, positioning itself between her and the door, muscles taut, breath controlled. Sleep became fragmented, her drifting off only to wake with the dog already standing alert, ears angled toward the forest, eyes reflecting firelight with an intensity that made her heart race, and when she finally slept more deeply, she dreamed of chains biting into frozen ground, of being unable to move while the world closed in. Morning brought no relief, only heavier snowfall and a sky pressed so low it felt suffocating, and when the power flickered and died, the dog reacted violently, barking once into the void before going silent again, as though silence itself were the safer option. She bundled up to check the generator, the dog glued to her side, every step outside feeling like a mistake even as the necessity forced her onward, and it was there, beyond the reach of the cabin's light, that the dog froze, nose buried in a drift that concealed something metallic and cold. The scent was wrong, sharp and human and old, and before she could understand what she was seeing, the dog had begun digging frantically, snow spraying as a length of steel chain emerged from beneath the surface, its other end disappearing into the forest as if anchored to the mountain itself. Panic surged, logic fracturing, and she tried to pull the dog back, but it would not retreat, not now, not with danger this close, and the wind carried a sound then, unmistakably human, a strained breath or a stifled movement, close enough to feel, far enough to be obscured. Fear turned her limbs heavy, but the dog moved decisively, dragging her away from the chain, forcing distance between her and whatever lay at the other end, its training and instincts converging into a single directive: survive. They retreated indoors, barricading themselves against the storm and the unknown, but the sense of being watched did not fade, instead intensifying until even the walls felt thin and temporary, and the dog paced relentlessly, refusing food, refusing rest, eyes constantly returning to the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Hours passed measured only by the wind's relentless howl and the growing cold, and when a distant engine cut through the storm, the dog reacted with explosive urgency, slamming its body against the door in warning, forcing her to retreat deeper into the cabin as shadows passed beyond the frosted windows. Somewhere in the mountains, the former SEAL felt the same engine echo through his bones as he ran a familiar trail that suddenly felt hostile, the storm closing in, his instincts flaring with the certainty that something was wrong, that someone nearby needed help even if he could not yet see how their paths were connected. Back at the cabin, the sense of imminent threat escalated into action when the door handle rattled violently, a test rather than an attempt, and the dog placed itself squarely in front of her, stance wide and immovable, prepared to absorb whatever came next. The handle went still, replaced by footsteps circling the structure, deliberate and patient, and she realized then that this was not random, not opportunistic, but planned, the storm chosen as cover, the isolation exploited with precision. The dog tracked every movement with unblinking focus, body coiled like a spring, and when a window shattered inward, snow and glass spraying across the floor, the animal lunged without hesitation, meeting the intrusion with ferocity born of love and duty. The struggle was violent and brief, shapes colliding in the confined space, the dog sustaining injuries as it drove the threat back through the broken frame, blood staining its fur dark against the white that poured in, and when the intruder retreated, vanishing into the storm, the dog collapsed momentarily before forcing itself upright again, refusing to abandon its post. She tended to the wounds as best she could with shaking hands, tears freezing on her cheeks as the dog leaned into her touch, its breathing labored but steady, and the realization set in that escape was the only option left, staying only inviting another attack. They fled into the storm, following instinct more than direction, the dog guiding her away from danger even as its strength waned, leading her toward higher ground where tracks would be lost and visibility reduced, every step an act of defiance against those who hunted them. The cold was merciless, biting through layers, draining strength, and when her legs finally gave out beneath her, the dog refused to let her fall fully, pressing its body against hers, sharing warmth, dragging her when it had to, barking only once into the void as if calling for help it did not know would come. Behind them, the sound of pursuit resumed, distant but determined, and ahead, the mountain rose unforgiving and vast, the storm erasing paths and hope alike, leaving them trapped between exhaustion and an enemy that did not intend to let them disappear. And somewhere beyond the whiteout, a man trained to recognize the edge of catastrophe changed direction without knowing why, following a pull that felt like instinct and fate colliding, while the dog, bleeding and spent, made a final choice to stop running and stand its ground, chaining itself through loyalty and love to the woman it refused to leave, as the storm swallowed everything and the true danger closed in. The storm reached its cruelest intensity just as exhaustion finally claimed her, her body collapsing into the snow where the mountain narrowed and the wind screamed like something alive. And in that moment the truth revealed itself not as a single shock but as a convergence of all the warning signs she had tried to ignore. The chain no longer a mystery but a deliberate anchor meant to keep her exposed, meant to keep her alive just long enough to be found again, because this had never been about killing her quickly but about control reclaimed and punishment prolonged. The dog sensed it before she could fully lose consciousness, its body snapping into rigid alertness as shadows emerged from the whiteout, figures moving with certainty through terrain that should have disoriented them, the storm bending around their intent as if complicit, and when the first hand reached for her, the dog exploded forward with a ferocity that felt almost supernatural, teeth finding flesh through layers of winter gear, its injured body moving on instinct alone, buying seconds that felt like lifetimes. The attackers had underestimated what loyalty forged under training and love could become when cornered, and as they struggled to subdue the animal, another figure appeared through the blowing snow, moving not with confusion but with lethal clarity, the former seal cresting the ridge at full sprint, drawn by the single bark that cut through the storm like a signal flare. He took in the scene in fragments, the woman chained to frozen earth, skin blue with cold, the dog bleeding and fighting beyond its limits, the men panicking now that their isolation had been breached, and he acted without hesitation, muscle memory overriding fatigue as he closed the distance, the mountain becoming a battlefield once more. The fight that followed was brutal and fast, bodies colliding in a blur of snow and motion, the storm swallowing evidence even as it bore witness, and when it was over the attackers fled into the white, leaving behind the chain, the woman, and the reality of what they had tried to do. The seal dropped to his knees beside her, cutting the chain with hands that shook for the first time in years, the metal clanging uselessly against rock as he freed her, but it was the dog he reached for next when it finally collapsed, its body giving out only once it was certain the threat had passed, its breath shallow, blood dark against the snow. Time slowed into something fragile and precious as he worked to keep both of them alive, wrapping the dog in his own jacket, pressing warmth into its failing body, feeling the faint but stubborn pulse that refused to surrender, while the woman hovered between consciousness and oblivion, her hand finding the dog's fur even as her eyes fluttered closed. The truth surfaced fully then, pieced together from the evidence left behind and the scars she carried, the chain a symbol of a past abuser who had tracked her into isolation, believing the mountains would hide his cruelty, believing a storm would erase accountability, and the realization hardened the seal's resolve as he prepared to move them both before the cold could finish what the attackers had started. Every step down the mountain was a battle against gravity and exhaustion, the storm resisting their descent as if angered by the intrusion of survival, but the dog remained alive, its heart beating stubbornly against impossible odds, its loyalty unbroken even in unconsciousness, and when rescue lights finally cut through the storm hours later, it felt less like salvation and more like the closing of a wound the mountain itself had opened. In the days that followed, as the woman recovered and the dog fought through surgeries and slow healing, the weight of what had happened settled into something heavier than fear, transforming into gratitude so deep it hurt, and the former seal found himself staying longer than planned, drawn back to the hospital room where a woman and her dog slept side by side, bound by something stronger than trauma. Investigators would later say that without the dog's intervention, without its refusal to flee, without its instinct to guard even when escape was possible, there would have been no rescue, no chance, and the seal knew they were right, because he had seen what loyalty looked like when stripped of comfort and safety. The dog survived, scars mapping its body like a history written in pain and courage, and when it finally stood again, unsteady but determined, it did so facing the woman, pressing its head into her hand as if reaffirming a promise made long before chains and storms tested it. The mountain returned to silence eventually, the storm passing, tracks erased, but the story remained, carried forward in the way the woman never walked alone again, in the way the seal understood that even after a life spent in war, the bravest thing he had ever witnessed was a wounded dog choosing to stand between the person it loved and the world that tried to break her, proving that loyalty, once chosen, does not retreat, it holds the line until the very end. The days after the storm unfolded slowly, measured not in hours but in heartbeats, machines humming softly in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and second chances, where warmth replaced the cruel indifference of the mountain and survival felt unreal enough to be fragile. The woman drifted in and out of sleep beneath heavy blankets, her body wrapped in careful layers, frostbite treated, bruises blooming like dark memories across her skin, and every time consciousness returned fully, her hands searched instinctively for coarse fur and the steady rise and fall that anchored her to the present. The dog lay beside her bed despite wires and bandages, stitched and shaved in places where the storm and violence had taken their toll, its body thinner now, its movements slower, yet its eyes never left her for long, tracking each breath she took as if still guarding against an invisible threat. Doctors spoke in careful tones about hypothermia, trauma, recovery timelines, but none of that carried the weight of what had truly saved her, because survival had not come from medicine or chance alone, but from a living, breathing choice made again and again by an animal that refused to abandon its post. The former seal visited often during those first days, moving quietly through hallways as if still mindful of unseen dangers, his presence steady and grounding, the kind of calm that only comes from having stood on the edge before and returned, and though he said little, the gravity of what he had witnessed stayed etched into him, reshaping something deep and permanent. Investigators pieced together the truth with grim efficiency, tracing the chain, the tracks, the intent behind the storm-timed attack, confirming what her nightmares had already known, that the isolation had been exploited by someone who believed fear could be reclaimed and ownership enforced. And when the arrest finally came, it did not bring triumph so much as release, the closing of a door she had spent years bracing against. Healing, however, was not linear, and the quiet moments were often the hardest, when the adrenaline faded and memory crept in uninvited, when the weight of nearly losing everything pressed down harder than the storm ever had. In those moments, the dog became more than protector again, returning to the role it had always played, grounding her through routine and presence, nudging her hand when anxiety tightened her chest, positioning itself between her and doorways without conscious thought, its loyalty woven so deeply into its being that even injury could not unteach it. Physical recovery demanded patience from them both, slow walks replacing long ones, careful exercises guided by professionals who marveled at the animal's resilience, scars fading from raw to silver as weeks turned into months, each small milestone celebrated not with words but with shared stillness and mutual understanding. The seal eventually prepared to leave the mountain town, his own routines calling him back, yet something tethered him there longer than expected, a sense that witnessing that kind of devotion carried responsibility, that stories like theirs deserved to be remembered, not sensationalized, but honored for what they revealed about courage stripped to its essence. On the day he finally said goodbye, he paused longer than necessary outside the rehabilitation center, watching the woman and her dog move together across the snow-dusted ground, their steps synchronized again, slower than before but deliberate, and he understood then that survival was not just about making it through the worst moment, but about choosing to keep living afterward. Winter loosened its grip eventually, snow retreating from the mountainsides, trails re-emerging where danger had once erased direction, and with the thaw came a quiet reclaiming of space, the woman returning to the outdoors not with naive confidence but with earned strength, every step accompanied by the steady presence at her side. The dog, fully healed though forever marked, seemed to carry its scars with pride rather than burden, moving with renewed purpose, eyes still sharp, still watchful, but softened now by the knowledge that it had won, that it had fulfilled the promise it never needed words to make. Community support gathered around them in ways neither had expected, gestures of kindness replacing isolation. Yet even surrounded by others, their bond remained singular and complete, forged in the moments when no one else had been there, when survival hinged on instinct, trust, and the refusal to let go. Nights grew quieter again, the silence no longer threatening but restorative, and when the wind howled through the trees, it carried no fear with it, only memory, a reminder of how close the edge had been and how fiercely they had held on. The former seal returned to his life changed in subtle ways, his understanding of bravery recalibrated, knowing now that heroism did not always announce itself with noise or weapons, but sometimes stood bleeding in the snow, shielding another body with its own. The woman found herself healing not by forgetting what had happened, but by integrating it, allowing the experience to reinforce rather than fracture her sense of self, drawing strength from the fact that even when she had been at her weakest, she had not been alone. The dog aged as all living things do, muzzle slowly graying, movements eventually stiffening, but its role never diminished, remaining constant through seasons and changes, its loyalty unaltered by time, its presence still the first thing she reached for each morning and the last thing she felt before sleep. Years later, when the mountain storms returned with familiar fury, they faced them together without fear, understanding now that survival was not the absence of danger, but the presence of unwavering devotion. And in the quiet that followed each storm, in the soft weight of a head resting against her leg, in the steady rhythm of shared breath, lived the enduring truth of their story, that love chosen freely is stronger than chains, that loyalty is an act of courage renewed every day, and that sometimes the purest form of heroism comes not from those trained to fight, but from those who simply refuse to leave the ones they love behind.